Well, I guess I'll get us started. So, welcome everybody. I'm Joan McGarry. I'm the Director of Education and Visitor Engagement here at the museum, and I'm really thrilled to have our panel here today with us. Really grateful to Tony for jumping on board with it right off the bat when I sent him that crazy email asking him to come here and discuss the outsiders in art. He didn't even query what that might mean. So I admire his adventurous spirit. Tony, we left him up to picking the panel himself. We really wanted him to really think about who he thought would be great contributors to the panel. So I'm going to let Tony introduce everybody in a minute. But I just want, he had to write it on here for me because I said, of all the things I'm going to remember, I will forget what you do, believe it or not. But obviously he's, hopefully everybody knows, a wonderful columnist for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. He's also an associate editor there. And he is a book reviewer and editor, book editor. Thank you, that was not too much to remember. I appreciate the cliff notes. So hopefully everybody's had a chance to see the exhibition upstairs, Telling Tales, because this is actually a program associated with Telling Tales. There is a segment in the exhibition called Examining the Outsider. And when we started looking at this exhibition, this was one of the things that really intrigued us. Well, who are the outsiders? Why are the outsiders? What exactly does outsider mean? And why do artists feel compelled to examine the outsiders in their art? So, for those of you who are maybe not familiar with what we mean by outsider, these are people who are marginalized by the society in which they are residing. So in reference to the exhibition upstairs, the four groups that were considered marginalized in the 19th century were the people who lived in poverty, you've got a lot of images of street urchins. That was not unusual to see children living on the street. So your urban poor in particular. You have your African Americans, particularly at this point in time in the exhibition upstairs. Slavery was ending. These were people who were trying to be integrated into society, both by themselves and by the people who were trying to help them get there. You also have the Native Americans. And I'm forgetting,
Women are marginalized.
Oh yeah, and actually there's one image in particular that references that, and it's the, told you, there's a lot to remember, the Intelligence Bureau.
Oh yes.
But really an interesting painting. It seems pretty benign when you look at it, when you read the label and you understand what you're looking at. It's really quite mind-blowing. The other thing that, and I'm going to stop talking in a minute, Tony and I talked about a lot when we met was how, when we examine the outsider today, we're maybe a little less genteel about it, which I happen to think is a good thing. But if you look at the images upstairs, they're very romanticized and beautiful and benign. And we're going to be looking at a lot of art that maybe isn't quite so romantic or benign. It's really confronting the issues head on. Okay. So I'm going to let Tony talk a little. I'm going to scroll through some images of more contemporary outsider artists while Tony's talking.
Right, and keep your eye on the screen because this art isn't here. You haven't had a chance to sort of absorb it like the art upstairs. This will give you an idea where our conversation is going to go. So.
If I can get it going.
Let me know when you're ready. All right, the inescapable irony of a panel like this is that it's inevitably peopled by insiders. Outsiders are not usually called upon by great institutions like this one to interpret their own experience. One runs a good chance of being named an unindicted co-conspirator if the microphones are ever turned over to those who are more often than not the subject of the Academy's gaze. That's why you hire insiders with enough outsider street cred to do the honors. This isn't to say insiders thrust into this role aren't deeply sympathetic and supportive of the outsider's aspirations. In fact, the men and women on this panel have occupied different points along the continuum of insider-outsider for years. What makes a discussion like this one we're going to have here today so interesting is that not everything has to be so clearly defined that 90 minutes is mysteriously eaten away by panelists describing their particular ism in excruciatingly boring detail. So, I don't know about you folks, but I share George Orwell's distrust of jargon, especially artistic philosophical jargon. I'm easily bored by insider language that seems specifically constructed to keep the rabble at bay and to limit access to the institution's inner circle. I prefer the plain talk of the outsider to the gaseous prattling of the insider. And it may be a bridge too far to say one is always more honest, that one is always more honest than the other. But in my case, I know which one I prefer more. Now, before anyone points out the obvious, I know that I'm not immediately in danger. I know that I'm immediately in danger of conflating two different things on this panel. Isn't there a difference between outsiders and outsider art? Outsiders are those Native Americans, African Americans, women, and marginalized people captured in subservient or disempowered moments in the paintings on display upstairs. These marvelously composed, painted, and sculpted works are steeped in colonial assumptions that reflect the Eurocentric gaze of its creators. We know what that's about. After the formal beauty of these pieces have been acknowledged, we may or may not get around to pointing out that the subjects of the artist's gaze were seen as objects before they were seen as subjects. They are obliged to look down or look away from the painter and society the painter represents. When it comes to outsider art, you have a different dynamic altogether. You have the former subjects of the artist's gaze looking back at you. Sometimes this art has a temerity to judge you. It doesn't try to be aesthetically appealing to the Academy. It is proud of its rude manners and brutal honesty. It answers to nothing but its marginalized master's will. It's about intentionality. Now, here's a twist. There is much outsider art that is made by insiders who nonetheless feel marginalized. This still counts as outsider art in my humble opinion. Is this an arbitrary distinction? Probably. There's a slipperiness to all of this that must be acknowledged. Still, I would go even further. I would go so far as to say that all artists start out as outsiders until they're validated by a gallery or curator or gatekeeper of some sort. The question then becomes whether they remain outsiders beyond the moment they're magically transformed into insiders and given the keys to the Academy. That probably has more to do with the disposition and psychology of the artist more than anything else. So one question the panel should discuss is whether distinctions like outsider versus outsider art makes any sense when what we're really talking about on a subliminal level is who gets access to places like the Westmoreland Museum of Art and how. With that, I will introduce the panel and then call upon them to do quick surveys of their work so you have a context to know where their comments are coming from. We're going to start from my far right. Darnell Airborne Sun Chambers is a visual artist, teacher, and florist from San Diego, California. Known as Dolly to his friends and admirers, he's committed to social justice and serving the unmet needs in the community. Next to Dolly is Caitlin Bruce. She's an assistant professor of communication at the University of Pittsburgh. She studies the way public art creates spaces for encounters across difference and has been focusing on transitional art in transnational contexts. Her first book about legal graffiti, city-sponsored muralism, and feminist art in the US and Mexico will be published next year. And last, we have Dawn Weleski, a social practice artist, and she is the co-founder of the experimental art project known as Conflict Kitchen, a restaurant in the heart of Shinley Plaza, where food is the medium and political conflict is a tool of practice. Conflict Kitchen has focused on food from Afghanistan, Cuba, North Korea, Palestine, and other places that I'm no doubt forgot. Did we ever do like right there?
No.
Because that's probably,
You can pretty much do anything.
Anyway, basically, you have to be a country that we're at war with or we thought we would invade one day. So, before we get to our panel discussion, I invited the artists to give you guys a greater idea of what they do. Dawn will be the first to run you through images connected to Conflict Kitchen and so forth. But keep these images in your mind because we're going to be coming back to those.
Man, it's hot outside. I just flew in from Melbourne, and it's winter down there. And talk about it'll be interesting to just have flown back from there and have this conversation with you guys. I'm really excited to hear your comments and have you participate because I'll tell you what, when I present this work in that sort of context and we talk about neocolonialism and things like that, there's definitely a crowd engagement. So looking forward to being challenged by you guys today. Yeah, let's start here. So just real briefly, I'm going to go through these just to give you guys a general scope of Conflict Kitchen. I also do other work that involves wrestling matches and operas and mock sporting drafts with collaborators around the world to engage with people basically that are in interstitial spaces, right? Sort of the black holes, the energy that is culminating in a particular area in public space, but is kind of invisible. You can't quite see. The light doesn't escape. So what I like to try to do is bring light to those conversations and not to answer questions, but to provoke more questioning. So this is a work that I worked on with John Rubin. This started in the East Liberty neighborhood of Pittsburgh. Who's been to East Liberty lately? Okay, who was in East Liberty 8 years ago? Anybody notice a difference? All right, okay, just gonna leave it at that. That's another conversation. So this was corner of Dawn and South Highlands, an empty space bookended by the Shadow Lounge and Ava Lounge. Don't know if you guys had ever been to those spaces. Amazing community engagement spaces, music venue, bar, lounge. Sometimes there was a little bit of food. I was working with John within a class that he was doing called the Storefront Project, and the Storefront Project went to empty or abandoned spaces throughout Pittsburgh, and students were charged with creating a work of art inside that empty space, right? Now, if we want to talk about the gentrification of East Liberty, now rebranded as the East End, we can definitely have that discussion and how art can be a part of that for sure. But let me delve into this specific project that was created here by these students. So this was right before it became the art project that it was, a tuxedo shop where everyone would go to get, you want to go rent your tuxedo for a wedding or maybe get your wedding gown there. It was turned into the waffle shop, which was if you see in the lower left-hand corner there, which was an actual waffle restaurant. So we served bacon and eggs and coffee and tea, but we were only open from 11 p.m. till 3 a.m. Friday and Saturday nights and Saturday and Sunday mornings for brunch. So kind of this weird space. So, but not just a cafe, it was also a live streaming talk show that we produced with our customers. So after you had ordered your waffles or your eggs, people would get together on stage that normally wouldn't get together, who were possibly sitting beside each other at the waffle shop, and folks that wouldn't typically meet, or the conversations that might not typically happen in a community space across, cultures and age and, opinions. Oh man, that was the night that the Stanley Cup was last one in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, actually, just remembering. This guy was walking around and carried it in. And the idea is that the waffle shop stage was only this high, but anyone could come on stage to engage and use it as a performative platform to discuss whatever they would like to discuss. And there were some serious conversations and some really funny conversations. And over the 4.5 years that we were open, we had over 10,000 people on stage. And utilizing the waffle shop as a means to engage the public, we saw that really what it was about the waffle shop was the food that was sort of the seduction to get people to come into the door, right? And so the way in which we said, you know, we could have a free talk show, oh, just come up on stage and talk, but there's no value exchange there. So that's another important thing that we like to think about when we think about the economy of how something is valued, right? So we would bring people in by them purchasing like a cheap waffle. You could come in without purchasing a waffle, but you could also come in and purchase the waffle and then fund the project itself. So it became a self-sustaining enterprise. So utilizing that model and seeing food as a seduction and also as a way to get people to sort of come and sit down at the same table, break bread, maybe discuss things they normally wouldn't typically discuss with strangers. We thought, why not push it a little bit further and engage in cuisines that don't exist in Pittsburgh. There's no Venezuelan cuisine, Afghan cuisine, no Cuban cuisine, no Iranian cuisine. And we realized we were naming cuisines from countries with which the US government is in conflict, and that's how the Conflict Kitchen Project was born, which was right next to the waffle shop. And you can see there, it was actually like just this facade to get around code, which was just like sort of stapled against the side of the building, floating there. And you would look inside that window, and you would also see people still cooking waffles. So it was a little confusing. But that's what was exciting about it. And we're not going to show video today, but just briefly go through the story. So our first iteration, we served Iranian cuisine. And not only are you getting the Iranian food, but you're also reading the opinions and perspectives of Iranians in Iran, as well as those that have immigrated to Pittsburgh. So the idea is that we're not talking or educating about the country. You are speaking with the people through the food wrapper itself, as well as through the public programming that we do. So are the people at the takeout window that are our staff are also engaging with you, not to necessarily, again, educate, but to provide a platform for admitting their own ignorances and encourage you to admit your own as well. Then we would go out of business every 6 months. This is our Afghan iteration to highlight a new set of perspectives and opinions, cuisine, and then, of course, working with designers in that country, as well as our designer here, create a whole new facade, do a whole new set of interviews, with La Cocina Areva serving Venezuelan food. And then we were finally able to travel to one of the countries, Cuba, to do some of the research there and meet with people in person in the country. Here's Robert Sayer, our culinary director, cooking with people in their homes. We would go to the markets and shop with people. We would sit down, and it's basically just like, man, as an artist, it's super cool. I get to travel around the world and just eat with people, eat and drink. Oh, best job ever. Best job ever. And walking through, actually away from one of the interviews, spotted the North Korean embassy in Cuba. Like, whoa. So, okay, so went up, rang the doorbell. This North Korean ambassador comes out. So it's that idea that it's like people are approachable if you approach them, right? Why not ring the doorbell to the North Korean embassy? When else am I going to get a chance to do that, right? Guy comes out, you know, stands at the gate, and we talk about, say, oh, like, what's the difference between North Korean and South Korean food? So starting with food, about, you know, something that's potentially a more conflicting subject, even though food is very political, is a way to ease into those more sensitive conversations. Came back and then did Cocina Cubana. So this was all in East Liberty. And eventually we were able to transition to our Chambly Plaza location where we wanted something a bit more substantial. But on the way to doing that, we were constantly doing public programming and events. So here, for example, this is inside the waffle shop. It's a live Skype meal with Iran. So we had an elongated table inside of the waffle shop, butt up against a live projection feed, which we could actually do here. To a live stream in Iran, where they had an elongated table there. And we had a conversation across 2 continents, sort of an intercontinental dinner party where we served the same food on both sides of the table and discussed the things you would talk about at a dinner party with strangers, getting to know one another. Just the average conversation that you might have, which of course, you know, is dictated by the people at the dinner table. But it's sort of the most everyday stuff that can become the most extraordinary, right? And we did an Afghan documentary film screening of Afghan filmmakers under the age of 25, their first films. It was their first Q&A and first screening. We had Pittsburgh's first ever Persian Cultural Festival that was a collaborative engagement with the Persian student organizations that were at Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh. And it was the first time that we saw that we were able to be a resource to those that we had reached out to in their communities and said, you know, we don't just want you to lend your voice, but now they were coming to us and saying, well, we have trouble accessing sort of the average Pittsburgher that doesn't know about our events. They think that they're closed to some extent, you know, and so we were able to create that bridge, and we saw that, you know, maybe we have something here. We can continue to be that bridge in some ways. This project is still there. On the top of the roof of what used to be the waffle shop in that building is a public storytelling billboard that John Rubin, my collaborator, has. He uses it for something else now. But previously we were curating in basically just quotes that the folks had that we were highlighting that were a part of the country that we were highlighting. So like a tragic comedy, the US government's actions have actually helped the Iranian government and hurt the people of Iran. Iran is home to the largest number of Jews anywhere in the Middle East outside of Israel. And of course, we got to advertise Conflict Kitchen, let people know it's open 7 days a week. And then when we had to close down, we started doing these small paladars, which are meals inside of people's homes, sort of a mirror of a model that exists in Cuba, the only private enterprise that folks are allowed to have in Cuba, these private restaurants. And then reopened in Shenley Plaza, again with Iranian food. So the idea is that we don't just do the cuisine once and then leave it. We return to it if it's in the news, if it's something that needs to be talked about, or if the community is saying, hey, you know, it's about being responsive to the community. We need to bring this up again. We need to talk about this. We finally got a real grill and some tables where people were able to sit. Shenley, how many folks have been to Shenley Plaza? It's kind of like a little bit of a public square where we don't have a downtown in Pittsburgh, right? We don't have a place where people gather for the most part. So Shenley Plaza is kind of like this weird little public square that we have now. So thankful that's there, and certainly butt up against the museums and the universities and other cultural institutions that are privileged. And so we get an interesting cross-section of people there that we weren't getting in East Liberty. And we saw that people were really reading the materials, which was pretty awesome, which we weren't able to see prior, because folks were able to sit down. So we kind of now see ourselves also as a publishing house. For example, we do these small books that are actually stories and interviews that grandparents do with their grandchildren in these other countries. This is the Palestinian version of that. We also do something called The Foreigner, where we say, hey, you know, would you like to eat with Sohrab Kashani? He's an Iranian, and you know, you're going to have your Iranian food. Why not sit down and eat with an Iranian and ask some questions? You know, you say, oh, great, sure, I'd love to eat with an Iranian. Why not? I mean, I'm here. I'm trying to learn about Iran. What have you? And we say, but you're going to have to do that through the body of Elise Walton, one of our staff members. So you go around the corner and you're like, what? Like, why is this white chick with dreads sitting there? And I'm supposed to be talking to an Iranian. Like, this is not what I expect. So there's a bit of confusion there. And you sit down, and Elise has some headphones on, and you're mic'd up. And so Elise says, you know, hi, how are you? My name's Sohrab. Like, okay, hi, I guess I'll play along. And you begin to have this conversation with Sohrab. Sohrab's actually connected live in Iran. So anything that you're saying, Sohrab hears live. He says verbatim, answers your question verbatim, goes into the headphones of Elise, and then Elise says exactly what he's saying as he says it. So Sohrab speaks English. And then we do this with a number of other countries that we've been highlighting. But in doing that, there's that one person removed, that layering and that confusion of race, of opinion, of gender, of sexual orientation, of any number of things that are the differences between two human beings. Not even an Iranian and American, but just two human beings, period. And so it was interesting that a lot of people felt more comfortable approaching Sohrab about things that were going on in Iran because Elise was there. She was sort of like this human avatar that could kind of like ease people into a conversation they might be afraid to have. So John and I do projects in a number of other countries that are not spin-offs of Conflict Kitchen, because a lot of folks are like, oh, bring Conflict Kitchen to Brazil, for example. It's like, you can't do that. It exists within the context of Pittsburgh and the needs of the Pittsburgh community, right? So we said, okay, we'll go down to Brazil, and we'll do a project. We're doing some research for a Venezuelan iteration. So how about we get a Barack Obama impersonator and a Hugo Chavez impersonator. This is when Chavez was still alive. We'll have folks go around in romantic swan boat rides with them and have Brazilians say to them what they think of these foreign leaders. It's like, you get a ticket, you can go on this free swan boat ride in Porto Alegre, Brazil. and you can have a conversation with Barack Obama or Hugo Chavez. And then verbatim, those conversations become the opinions that are owned by the leaders as public speeches on floating platforms in the middle of this lake. So I think I should maybe need to stop. I'm not sure how long to go. Anyway, we can pause it right there. Lots to talk about at a different time. But
Excellent.
yes.
In fact, before we go to Kate and Bruce, I mean, you know, the fact that Dawn is, what was the term? A social practice artist. A social practice artist is, how would you define a social practice artist?
I would say that relationships between people are the medium of my work instead of paint or clay. So I'm molding relationships constantly. Yeah,
which is which would make you an outside artist or an inside
kind of. I mean, it's weird because we had this conversation on the phone. Is that this genre of work, which is very much a part of the way that many artists work in general, and have been for some time, has been co-opted more recently in the last maybe 20 years, and has become more institutionalized. So there are now masters of fine arts just in social practice. And that can be problematic and useful depending, I don't know. It's like, I like to say I keep one foot in the art world and one foot out. It's try to help so that they both serve each other.
It's an interesting tension.
Yeah.
So. All right, next we have Kate and Bruce, who's going to talk to us quickly about her particular expertise, graffiti and muralism and so forth.
Hi. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation, both from the museum and from County. It's really exciting to be in conversation with two really talented and interesting artists, because I do not do art, I write about art. So my practice is words, and putting words to things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of graffiti and some of the tensions. Okay. I'm going to talk about graffiti history. Is this on? Thank you. The history of graffiti and some of the ongoing tensions between outsider and insider that we sort of learned from that history and how it's changing in the present moment. My research is interested in art as a space for encounter, so Dawn's work would certainly fit within that category. And I'm interested in how in graffiti culture in particular, which has historically been a very multicultural scene, there are these encounters going on constantly. So graffiti arguably, started with cave paintings, but its modern iteration started both in New York and Philadelphia. So in 1973, the New York Times writes this article about a young man named Taki 173. He was a delivery boy, and because he was a delivery boy, that enabled him to write his name all over the city, because that's what he was doing for his job. That kind of created like a sort of amplification of the graffiti factor, because young artists learned that this was another way to get fame and celebrity. And another pioneer in Philadelphia was cornbread. So these are two really important figures. Now, the context for the development of graffiti, I think, is really important when thinking about outsider identity, because graffiti started in the 1970s on the East Coast, New York, Philadelphia. So the 1970s is this period of deindustrialization. Both cities were hit really hard economically, and neighborhoods like the Bronx, or rather boroughs like the Bronx, the Brooklyn, Upper Manhattan, were really suffering. There weren't a lot of social resources. One of the writers at the time described the Bronx as being like a war zone because it was just so neglected. And so a lot of these youth, and they were very, very young, these are like 12-year-olds to 17-year-olds, like actual babies, took up paint cans and started writing to express themselves, to sort of bring culture to areas that were denied culture. So this is another image. This is by Martha Cooper, who was a really committed documentarian of the graffiti movement. And so I wanted to do this to show sort of then and now contrast. So this is 1983. Same artist, this is recently within the last 5 years. So this has to do with her development as an artist, but also developments in paint technology. There's now spray paint made specifically for graffiti artists. Before they were just using Rust-Oleum and PAM spray caps that they sort of like whittle down to make narrower. So that's a little bit of the background. And so you could already sort of see that these are artists that are not insiders in any sense. Racially and economically, they're largely people of color from lower economic backgrounds, although there also were white middle-class writers. But also they're not really going near the museums. They're using the city as their medium. And so, in a way, claiming their rights as urban citizens to express themselves, to re-image the city as a space that is more inclusive, more colorful, more dramatic. However, many of you probably know this wasn't really met with a lot of applause by the police in New York or in Philadelphia. So from the early to mid-'80s, there was a war on graffiti led by Mayor Lindsay. Afterwards, zero tolerance policing took hold, and so writers were really strictly censured, and they stopped riding on trains because it became not worth it, because the trains would be cleaned before they even could run, so you wouldn't get your fan. So you have this tension. And so in the late 70s, there were some forays that graffiti artists made into the gallery scene, but then it raises really interesting questions about what happens to graffiti when you move it from the wall or from the train to the gallery or to the museum. Does it lose its force? Does it lose its impact? Does it become weaker? And so forth. And so those are sort of some tentative steps. Now, in the last 10 or so years, graffiti has really taken off as a medium that sort of straddles the gallery and the street. So in New York in 2014, there was a beautiful retrospective at the Museum of the City of New York of this period that I just told you about. And so in our contemporary moment, it's being recognized as a legitimate art movement, which raises some serious questions about its future. Also, another important site, this is when graffiti is becoming, in some instances, legal. So this was a building in New York that was recently destroyed to build condominiums. This is a lot of the story of New York and art. But this is a space where artists would come to paint legally, and it was world famous. And so, again, the thing about art as a space of encounter, you had artists from all over the world who would dream about painting in this space. And so if you went any given day, like any Tuesday afternoon, you'd probably see an artist from the Netherlands, from Latin America, from New York, and so on, all sort of painting together. But it was destroyed, so it was seen as not valuable. In 2014 as well in Chicago, the Chicago Cultural Center held a retrospective. In Mexico City in 2014, there was the first museum exhibition of letter-based graffiti, so graffiti can use letters but also images, so this was sort of like valorizing letter-based graffiti. And since 1990, and this is in Paris in 2013, this was a building slated for demolition that was filled with beautiful street art, and it was only open for a month. And it brought crowds of about 5,000 every day to go look at it. So you can kind of see how this movement is becoming more popular and more recognized, but at the same time, it's not using the museum as its platform. It's using a lot of other platforms. One of the things that I study intensely is this global graffiti festival called the Meeting of Styles. It was founded in Wiesbaden, Germany in 1999. This is a contemporary image, and so it is a sort of melting pot of styles. The founder argues that graffiti functions as a way for people to valorize culture over commerce, so human relationships and expression over economic exploitation. You could have a debate about whether or not you avoid the commerce part. Different festivals are differently commercial. Some of them feel more like music festivals. But still, it's a really vibrant site where you have artists from across differences encountering each other. So within that tunnel over there, there's an artist from, I want to say Iran, and an artist from Israel that were having conversations about their nation-state's policies that both of them really disagreed with. The painting, the red one is by a French group. The one on the right, I think, might be a German group. So you have a sort of collision of styles. Just a couple more images. So this is a Chicago-based artist named Roman Stanek, still in Germany, another Chicago artist. And again, actually this artist is from Porto Alegre. So very, very subtly, he's criticizing FIFA. It's a very subtle critique. And then, so this is the same festival in Mexico, and so you can see how graffiti has evolved or changed to become more image-based in a lot of countries. And so this was all done with spray paint. It's like beautiful photorealist work. And this is actually not Chicago, this is still Mexico. This is Chicago. And this is sort of the more classic style that you saw. It really emulates a lot of what was going on in the 70s, but again, like higher quality paint allows you to do more things with figurative images and all that. This was a RIP piece for Spike Lee's brother. And this is a youth workshop that was run by a graffiti artist from Chicago and Perpignan, France, for youth in the housing projects there. So again, using graffiti as this medium to kind of bring two people together across social differences, to teach youth about alternative modes of expression. One of the narratives that I hear a lot when I interview graffiti artists is that the dramatic claim is graffiti saved my life, but the other claim that I find really compelling is that graffiti offered me an alternative, not to joining gangs, not to, doing things that were sort of violent, but rather a form of self-expression and valorization. So I'm going to stop there. I'm really happy to answer any questions.
All right, we're going to go to Darnell next, but that's terrific.
Hello everybody, my name is Darnell Chambers. Like Mr. Norman or Tony said, I'm from San Diego, California. I like to consider myself a native of Akron, Ohio. That's a great thing. I was raised in Akron, Ohio, so got to see LeBron play ball when he was younger. But yeah, I came to Pittsburgh for school in 2006 and graduated from the Arts School of Pittsburgh with a bachelor's degree in web design and interactive media. I intentionally went to school to study animation, but it was just a lot of drawing. I had thousands and thousands of drawings, and it was just something that I just kind of got away from. But you still can kind of see some of that in my artwork. So this area is just one of my touch of drawings. A lot of people consider me a portrait artist, but I like to consider myself a multidisciplinary artist. I do graphic design, web design, video, photography, almost any kind of art you can think of. Anything I get my hands on, I can probably do something basic. So yeah, this is some of my hustle work here. I'm also a florist, which is something that I really enjoy doing because I like to see people's faces when they see and came from the projects like designing flowers and dropping them off like these really big, amazing buildings. So yeah. But this is the actual video. So yeah, here are some of my portrait work. This is always mostly one of the people that inspire me. Jimi Hendrix, Snoop Dogg. That's the Jimi Hendrix color. This here is a portrait that I'm working on at the History Museum in Missouri right now. This guy's name is Moses Dixon. He was a freedom fighter, and he also started an organization called the Knights of Liberty, where he organized 100,000 men to fight against racism and white supremacy. So yeah, that's Moses Dixon. But right now I'm working on a mural in Missouri at the History Museum. So I'm studying with the historian named Gwendolyn Moore. It's pretty much got me reading over 2 years of research, and I'm learning about the civil rights era and how St. Louis played a major role in civil rights and the start of civil rights. But yeah, so that's Moses Dixon there. I'll be doing 3 portraits at the museum and 1 mural. So this here is the piece that I was working on after studying. I'm really into history, so I study on Africa a lot. A lot of my research I do is on Africa. And this is one of the tribes in Africa called the Massa in South Africa, Tanzania, and Kenya area. But I wanted to do some artwork to kind of just go along with what I've been researching. But you can kind of see some of my animation background from some of my work. And this here is a pencil drawing that I did of a guy named Charlton Tank. He was a really prominent figure during the civil rights movement. He actually helped in segregation of streetcars in St. Louis, but he sometimes he would grab some of the horses by the reins or like completely knock them out with a hammer. I thought that was kind of funny. But I'm also an art educator. I work in a couple community centers around Pittsburgh, from Garfield Youth Works to the Glass Center. I was an artist in residence at the Carnegie Library in Hazelwood. And with that project, I worked with a group of kids and just taught them basic art education, the principles of art, taught them how art can be used to empower and document the time. So through all my artwork, I try to empower the youth and get them to understand the importance of history and just education in general. So this here is just a cartoon that an animation that I'm working on currently. And yeah, that's some of my artwork. So.
All right. Thank you. So the question becomes, when we have such a range of artists and ways of interacting with society when the artists and the subject are no longer passive. Yet the artist and let's say in everyone's case, someone who's new to the community, who's not necessarily been integrated into the gallery system, the museum system, so forth. But he's still doing his work, you know. Is he an outsider or is he an insider by virtue of the fact that he has at least had some exposure? He's here at this museum today. He's doing some work for a museum in Atlanta. At what point does a term like outsider, insider become even nonsensical? You know, does it even matter anymore? Or are we just talking about how does one get access to this situation? So, and let's start with you, Eric. Like, what do you think? Do you think that you're an outsider or an insider?
I like to consider myself an outsider, but a lot of times that's my own choice. I think I've been given the opportunity to become something other than an outsider, but I think I'm an outsider just generally because of the fact that what I represent as a black man, as a straight black man, in America, I can be considered an outsider because most African Americans are outsiders in this society.
And we should pivot to the work upstairs, which is beautiful, and it's part of one of my panelists, co-panelists said it was like the founding fathers of art in many ways. But in some ways it can be problematic because of the objectification of particular identities, the objectification of Native Americans or women, marginalized people, and so forth. And I'd be curious to get your reactions, as folks who think about art and interaction and society, how you felt, what you felt in sort of ambivalence with art, and if so, why, and if not, why, and so forth. Want to start with you, Caitlin?
Yeah, it's a complicated question, especially because I haven't spent a ton of time in the area, but my first impressions were that the figures that were outsiders represented were largely in these positions of subservience, both spatially, like they're usually kneeling or like below other figures, or they're kind of in these situations of being judged or evaluated. One of the things that I thought was interesting in one of the sculpture of the peddler, and the caption is amazing. It's like this guy's daughter is asking him to buy her something, and he's like really pissed.
Yeah.
So his face is like all screwed up, and he looks like really angry. But that was a kind of interesting thing to look at because it shows kind of the power that the peddler had to destabilize the security of this like wealthy figure. So I mean, I think that we could read the images kind of against the grain and look for moments where they're disrupting this like dominator, powerlessness binary that's happening. But yeah, I mean, initially I was sort of thinking like outsider meant, oh, the producer of the work, represents some sort of unrecognized or less recognized community, but instead it was about sort of the object itself. And I mean, the last thing I'd say about that is, women and are chronically the objects of representation and not the subjects. So this is like a long and sort of dark history that art has had for centuries. So.
Yeah. Dawn?
I mean, some of the images that struck me the most, and I think particularly because Conflict Kitchen now is working on a series of indigenous nations iterations, are the representations of Native Americans upstairs. But it just immediately, of course, I see those representations and I feel a sense of anger, but it's a sense of anger in knowing that there are representations that are cartoons that exist that are making billions of dollars over decades for example, the mascot for the Cleveland Indians.
Right.
Or even just the terminology that is used used on a daily basis, and us not being comfortable enough to have discussions about, well, how do we talk about these things, or feeling safe enough to make those mistakes and have those discussions about how are these things represented and why are they represented in this way, and who are profiting off of those representations.
Right. Can you guys hear me? Do I need to hear?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's really interesting, you know, the slides that we saw at the beginning of all of this, and assuming that you've walked around, looked at the art that's upstairs, it really does represent two dramatically different epochs, and sort of like you see American understanding of art, not just the American understanding, but I mean, you know, it's almost as if, you know, they're two different planets. The place of art in each of these eras, you know, the contemporary era and the 19th century, let's say. And so, what kind of dialogue is possible between these two eras? Do we just sort of like approach it passively and just say, well, that's how folks painted then, and this is how they paint now? I mean, what can we learn from both eras? And is there a way to synthesize the lessons of both, or is that even necessary? So I'm just curious, if I throw it out to you folks, what is it that moves you about either or both epochs? You know, the contemporary stuff and the stuff upstairs. And anyone who wants to throw something out, just throw it out. Is there something that moves you about either period of work, and what is it? Let's start with the panel. Yeah.
More, for me, what stuck out the most was the lack of, I don't know if it's natural. Yeah, for me, I think there's a large chunk of, I guess, imagery that's missing in the American art museum. Like, I haven't really seen anything that I can relate to. I mean, besides the history that everybody's learning about, but I couldn't see things that I could like identify with.
There's no space for Darnell in that. You know,
I didn't see myself.
Like project or so forth.
Can he be more specific as to what he thinks was missing?
Just, even with some of the landscape paintings, I didn't really see much of just the inner city. I mean, besides T.D. Harris photos, I didn't really see much of, and maybe I seen like 2 or 3 paintings, but for the most part, I didn't really see much that represented the majority of us who are low income. So that's
And that's important to you. That's important to have like something that resonates with your experience, so that you don't feel that you're just ignored, that you're not, or maybe you don't necessarily want the image that is there that might resonate a little bit be one that's subservient.
right. And then a lot of times, especially when I was teaching a lot of the kids, a lot of them, they don't really see images of themselves, so they don't feel like they can identify with coming. A lot of them even never been to a museum. I took a group of kids to the museum because they've never been to one. So like, when we come to these kind of places, we want to see things that we can identify with, or things that speaks to us in our struggle.
Sorry, we really do need to use the microphone. There's a lot of people who can't.
Oh, okay. All right. I see a hand back there. Yes, ma'am.
I see what you're saying, and I appreciate that, but I know for myself, when I go to a museum, I'm looking for inspiration of things that don't resonate with me, like to begin something, some kind of new idea or new vision. I like something that I've never seen before. So even though I look for things that I can identify with, I'm always delighted and amazed when I find something that inspires me that I never knew was in me. So I'm looking for something different too.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely do the same thing. But I'm speaking for a lot of the people who don't have a voice and who haven't been introduced to these kind of images. So,
Yes, sir.
Most of the images upstairs, it seems that the audience that was looking at them in their time would have been middle class or upper middle class folks. it wouldn't really be addressing the American Indians or the African Americans or any of those people who can see that work. So it sort of misses the point a little bit. Whereas the contemporary outsider art, like graffiti art, is like, that's different. That when I lived in New York in the 70s and I saw those subway cars, I mean, it was very incredible. But I was looking at them from an artist's viewpoint and thinking, wow, they're great, I'm really cool. But most of my contemporaries were all like, copy those kids, we gotta kill them, over them, spray over them. But I mean, that's where the growth is. That's why outsider art for me is so important. But what all three of you are doing up there is it comes from a different place than the art from upstairs. It's the focus of the audience now. I can as an audience member, I can see it. It's not in museums. I mean, those things work in galleries. This work is not. It's where the people are. And that's what makes it so.
Yes, ma'am.
It's an outsider artist becomes popular enough to be in a museum. He's been co-opted.
Now, is that a word that we should use, co-op? Or, I mean, because maybe outsider artists wanted to be there because that would be the most appropriate forum for his or her work.
I just think it loses some of its power when it's not seen within the context in which it was created. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be in the museum. I'm saying that it loses something when it's in the museum.
You guys agree with that?
Yes. Agree, for sure. So it was interesting because, so if we think about Pittsburgh graffiti artists that we want to talk about, like for example, I just, two recent, actually Post-Gazette articles, not to advertise them, but back to back, where there was an article about, about Danny, but the article prior to that, maybe a month before, was, do you guys know Mook? M-O-O-K. So the article, he was being interviewed and he's like, oh, I'm so happy now. I work at a tattoo shop. I'm never going to do anything illegal again. And then Danny, who is another very prevalent, he's been, has a number of different tags. He has a new one, we think a new one out now. It's not for sure that it's Israel. We're not, probably, we'll see. But anyway, but his tag was MF1, one of his main tags. But the idea is like, and it's interesting to see your presentation because it's like, okay, we have an educated white woman person of whatever origin that has a level of education in a museum, and we're talking about these representations of people that are doing it potentially illegally that is now being okayed. So it's like, the question is, so when someone gives you permission to do something that previously part of maybe why you were doing it was because there was a lack of permission or an illegality associated with it, and that was part of the point of doing it, then is some of the power more removed? I don't know. Yeah.
Outsider art to me is in your face art. It says, look, here it is. I'm telling you how I see the world. And it's out here and you can't escape it. You don't have to agree with it, but here it is. This is what I see. This is what I'm telling you.
And that's the difference between what's upstairs and I believe in telling tales. As Dennis was saying, that's for a specific audience, upper to middle white class folks. That's romanticism, that is escapism, that's telling a story, whereas the modern, the contemporary is in your face. It might make you uncomfortable, but that's what it's supposed to do. That message, that in-your-face message, I hope the point is to get people to think what it is. What's the artist's point of view in that regard?
And the only thing I object to is what it's supposed to do, because I don't think outsiders care what it's supposed to do. They're having a conversation. They're starting it. There it is.
We used to think I used to think, if I saw like a graffiti artist or any outside artist go into gallery or a museum venue, you think, oh, they sold that.
You just thought that automatically by virtue of the fact that they walked in there. So, I'm sorry, yes, sir.
I think when talking about develops naturally. There's not just the visual artist. It's dependent on the people who write with words. The knowledge comes through the whole society. It leaks through. And then guys like you with talent pick it up. You have your techniques. You develop them. The thoughts go through your mind. You think of it before the public is, because you're not thinking of raising a child or other things that your public is involved in. You're specialists. And I think it comes from this knowledge pushes along and suddenly begins to realize, because you're showing them the examples, you're demonstrating it becomes real.
So the artist as a shaman, as someone who's like manipulating abstract knowledge and making magic, and then the public either catches up or doesn't catch up. Well, I mean, that's a very romantic view of the artist too. I mean, there is some of that, but
I knew Jacob Lawrence when I was like 12 years old. I saw a beautiful tree he made. It wasn't political or anything else, but he was doing political things.
Absolutely.
And people didn't know about him. He gradually gained this great fame, and because of his skill in designing and making a statement, he kept it moving. He added to the worth of it, the vision that he saw. And that's what I think developed out of the whole process of the whole society and other educated people and talented people talking about these subjects.
And that's the beauty of art, insiders, outsiders, whatever. There's a fluidity to it, but there's still a lot of pressure for artists to take sides, as it were. I guess Dennis is your name, was saying how there was a time when if an outsider artist went to a gallery or went to a museum, he felt, well, they sold out, But it's interesting that at the turn of the 20th century, these pranksters, the Dadaists, decided that they would take on that idea, that they would grab onto it, that Marcel Duchamp would take a bicycle wheel and attach it to a stool and put it in the middle of the gallery and say, this is art. Or he would take a urinal and stick it in the gallery and say, this is art. I had a teacher at the California Institute of the Arts, I was there for a year, who was a performance artist. And he had himself shot in the gallery, shot in the arm. He used to do weird things like go to LAX and shoot at planes that were coming in. And he would do other things that would get him arrested. But always, he said, the gallery context transformed what he was doing into art. He would have pictures of himself. He would have pictures taken of him shooting at planes. He would shoot away from the wings, but shoot in the general direction. And put the photos on the wall. It's really quite interesting because he challenged all of us to say why it wasn't art. And it's a hard thing to do at that point. So, man, lots of hands going up. So can we start with you and then Go back there.
Well, let me try this idea out on you. What I see when I see you talking and showing your pictures is maybe social art, political art, but my original understanding of outsider art is like a crazy bus driver who goes home at night and sits at the kitchen table doing something very strange and very uninfluenced by art and art school.
Unschooled,
Like for
unschooled.
example, the graffiti art was all very beautiful, unlike the graffiti we usually see, right?
That's one definition, but that's the outsider. I mean, that's the romantic, the Grandma Moses.
Well, yeah, that kind of art is very personal.
Mhm.
I mean, truly belongs to only that person. Okay.
Yeah.
It belongs to only that one particular person.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem to me you're doing yourself an injustice by simply calling it political art. Right?
No,
You're
yeah,
talking
right,
to people. And I mean, I see you four up there, not one of you is an outsider, right?
Well, right, and that's what I raised in my
Yeah.
introductory remarks.
Yeah.
Because we're here, how can we possibly be outsiders?
Right, you're all educated and this goes on.
But even if we weren't educated, if we were here, we wouldn't be outsiders.
Well, and I feel like if you got a real outsider, the audience would find that person rather off-putting.
That's my idea.
Because that
I just had a really fascinating question.
Okay, yeah. Harold is good.
And then we'll come to you.
I just have a very quick question. If we built a wall and invited artists to come and express themselves, and then at some point took a photograph of what they had done, mounted it somewhere, and rolled it over and then had somebody else do it. If this were an invited, safe space to express yourself, without that furtive quality, would it be as great? Would it be as exciting? You paint a lot differently when somebody's chasing you.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's what's interesting, right? So, like, in the context of these festivals, that's exactly what happens. So there's a series of legal walls, they have 3 days to paint, there's food, there are people walking around, you get to educate community members about the art, and because it's more low-key and slower, you can do more elaborate things, so it allows the art form to evolve. And so there's this question about, well, is the adrenaline, is the illegality the only way we define it? But I think that's not a very nuanced understanding of what art does. Like, I don't think it's outside, inside. I think it's about, like, where is the power placed? How do we distribute it in a more egalitarian way? And how do we turn places like museums and galleries into nodes, not centers, so they can disperse their power and share it?
Yeah.
And so I think those festivals do that kind of educational work. Now, I think there's a time and a place for the sort of very radical, like, F the system stuff. But that also sort of ignores how a lot of artists like you work with communities, work with residents. You know, you're not against everything all the time. So I think it's a spectrum more than sort of like a yes or no thing.
Well, I just wanted to say that I think that there's a lot of this unconscious bias that we spoke of earlier that I think allowing other artists to be recognized in museums would allow us to actually deal with. Like, I think there's a lot of things that we all need to learn about each other, and I think that it's hard to do that when there's only one side of things being shown. I think that, yeah, and then dealing with the layman versus the expert, I think that I think everybody can do art, but there's degrees to it. I think that you have to learn certain things in order to be able to actually accomplish it. I do think that there is traditions that still need to be kept just as much as there's certain things that...
You got to learn anatomy, you got to learn color theory, you got to learn composition, you got to learn all the formal elements, like if you're a painter, and so forth. Graffiti artists internalize that if they're really good ones. The really good artists, no matter how naive they are, they either internalize it or they learn it formally. Because I think at the very least, art needs to have some element, some scintilla of expertise somewhere in the mix. Otherwise, it becomes just sort of random scribbles, which can be beautiful too. You ask the abstract expressionist, but you know, to be an abstract expressionist, you have to understand composition too, to know when to stop and when to begin. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I don't know where this fits in. Thank you. I don't know where this fits in, but I think it does. I'm still reeling from the injustice of it. I watched a program on the BBC World News about the terrible migrant camp at Calais port in France. It's called the Jungle. It's been removed. But the way that the young kids, young men, young women, survived was graffiti art everywhere.
Right.
And so after, and they call it dismantling the camp, they just whitewashed everything until they came to this huge, enormous graffiti, black and white. And it was stunning. And then somebody saw down in the right-hand corner in tiny print, Banksy. So it was Banksy.
It's an amazing story. They kept it.
They kept it. Did you read about it?
Yes, I heard about that. It's an amazing story. The privilege that is accorded to those who are in the academy, even if they're doing the same thing as those outside of it, it really is a problem because either the work is formally beautiful or it isn't, right? Or why discriminate like that? Because it's Banksy and it's worth a certain amount of money, and that gets to the heart of access. Who can generate cash for the institutions and so forth. So, any more questions? Yes, ma'am.
Just have a comment about outsiders. I don't think we need that. About outsiders, I think that anybody who has a vision and a strong desire to create something is an outsider. If they're on the cutting edge of some type of art, even if it was a long time ago or up through the years, I think it takes guts and courage to be able to create your vision of whatever you see in the world. So I would say that anyone, like you said, that isn't making something for profit, or that's an outsider to me. That's my perspective. Somebody that is gutsy enough to create their own vision of the world. And I think that when they create something that isn't something that is something with poverty or difference, it's because it sparks some type of aliveness in them.
Oh, that's good. It was we got a couple of hands going up. It's in the middle there.
Well, for me, an outsider artist is just anybody that is kind of on the avant-garde. They're pushing they're on the frontier of what their style is. And they're really individualistic. I would include Banksy as an outside artist still. He actually would prefer to be there. I don't think that there is actually an advantage to being an inside artist per se. Being with the people, developing your own style, and being on the frontier, and having some sort of social commentary, for me, is what outside artists are about. Of course, traditional artists that study like aesthetically beautiful pieces upstairs, we know those are wonderful pieces. Those are really traditional. However, we are drawn more closely to the pieces that are more contemporary, more in your face. Exactly. Like, you're not going to see these always in museums, but for me, I think that outside artists they're just developing. They're saying what hasn't been said already, and that could be in many forms. It could be conflict kitchen. It can get everybody talking. It's graffiti. It's kind of just developing your individual style and kind of moving away from what's traditionally been taught. For me, more accepted.
We got some in the middle here. Okay, go ahead.
As an artist, for me, I've been painting, making art most of my life, and had a professional career that supported me that was on the outskirts of actually art, but my own personal art, I do because I have to. And now that I'm retired, I have a lot of art in my studio, and because the important is now monetary is to get rid of that art, or to sell that art, to sustain myself so I can buy more things, so that the art then becomes economic as well as just artistic. I mean, it becomes a sort of different thing then. It's the art that I'm selling often is different than the art that I'm doing for me too.
Thanks.
I just want to follow up on a question that has emerged, sort of floated to the surface. There doesn't seem to be any question that whether we're talking about outsider or insider, they're all in the same terrain of art, and that it is within that, and you've each touched on lightly on that in terms of what it is that you see the function of. What is it that both outsiders and insiders are doing? It's art. So even though it may be different terrain, different elements of that. And so I'd be curious if the panelists would talk about why they think it's important that they do what they do, and what is it that they think they're doing that makes it art, and puts them in, granted maybe in tension with an insider versus an outsider, but yet you're still both artists. What is it that, what common project is it that you're out, maybe in different places, in different areas of the terrain, what is it that you're doing that makes it art, and why is that important?
It's interesting. You want to start with Darnell?
Well, for me, art should be critical of society, if not a form of documenting the times that we. I think you can't separate artists from the times that we. I think that, yeah. So with that, I personally try to uplift and empower people through my artwork. I try to educate people through my artwork. I want to inspire you. Yeah. So yeah, for me, those are the main things.
Make you look it up, do research. Yeah, I think it's important in my work to definitely challenge and to, and I think I stated this before, to provide a forum for more questions to be raised than for answers to be answered. And I think when the work becomes didactic and tries to provide a set of things that one should think or is to think, then that sort of dogmatism can really prevent people from contributing to that dialogue and can shut that history down of what's represented as partially what happened upstairs. And I think that it's important just for, like for example, for Conflict Kitchen, for if we talk about insider or outsider, to recognize that it's very inside and it can be very outside at certain points. So there's a certain amount of privilege that was allowed to us because of the people that we've worked with in the past and the institutions that we're connected to, but there's also a set of, a certain set of things that we deal with that the institution can't help us with, that actually has become problematic. Like for example, our staff recently unionized. So it's a real public artwork now. You know, it's like our employees who we hired to work within the work as restaurant workers have decided they'd like to use the public artwork as a platform to discuss something that's important to them, regardless if it's a part of Conflict Kitchen's mission. It's important to them, and they're a part of the work too. So that's a really, for us, in some ways, it's very successful ways of seeing a true public artwork when it is co-opted by the public, right? And it's responsive to the public in that way, and that we have to respond. We're obligated to respond, and putting ourselves in a situation where we are obligated to do that and responsible for that.
So keep in mind the slides you saw at the beginning of the panel discussion. It's really interesting and intriguing work. Is it the sort of work that you want to see more of? Not just here, but I mean just in general. I mean, is it the sort of work that speaks to you? I mean, because it speaks to me. Yes, ma'am.
I think it's important to remember that before we had the camera, before we had Teenie Harris out there taking pictures of the community, which is recording history and is art at the same time, we had paint and brush. So all those things upstairs in the gallery, for the most part, except when they're representing some Roman figure and Roman story, that's people painting their world. That's what they see. We see the slave being sold. We see the Indian, the Native American being moved off his land. And even though they're in the corner, the painter is intentionally telling you, this is what's happening here. And of course, he always includes his bias.
Right.
Fortunate for us, we have the camera and the paint, and the pencil, and the performance, and the conflict kitchen. We have all those things, but all of it is us talking to each other about our world.
Isn't that beautiful? And that's, I agree. In fact, that for me would be the takeaway from a show like that, and seeing stuff that we saw here. And also honoring that tension between those worlds, because they're on a continuum, but one obviously is critiquing the other. When we look back as moderns critiquing, another era, and that's necessary so that we don't repeat it like looking for Donald Trump. Whoops, got political there. But yes, I think that's the beauty of the show. But I guess I'm just sort of mindful of these sort of internal critique, at least when I look at the show, I think, okay, all right, so forth, but still. Did you want to add anything to that?
Just say, more paintbrushes and more hands. Like as many hands as possible, as many, giving tools to as many people as possible to communicate about everyone's life, like your own life, right? And important so that there's a more diverse history instead of just a couple people's history.
I think that art is about shaping our sense of the possible, so I really appreciated your last comment. And so the question is, how do we create more platforms and spaces to amplify our sense of what can be possible in terms of including more diverse bodies? And I'm happy to have events like this take place. I think it would be even more fantastic if we could bring in some practicing artists and let people see their work in action.
To answer your question, I personally would not like to see more work like this. Because for me, that means that you just have the conversation and nothing's really being done. There's no action. So for me, I would like to see more, like I said, more diversity in the museums. But as far as just seeing more work that's just showing people or just talking about the same things that we all know need to be changed, I wouldn't like to see that. I would like to see some actual action take place so that we can produce art that is more about love and unity and those things.
We ran a little over.
Oh, did we? I thought I was going to. Oh, I see. We did go over. My apologies.
But I want to thank Tony and our panel, Dawn, Caitlin, Darnell, very much for coming out here. I think we really just began to scratch the surface of the conversation. I'm pretty sure they'd be happy to hang out a little longer and answer questions if you want to come up and talk to them. I love the idea of having more programs like this. So in the spirit of that, we actually have a questionnaire out on those tables. Please take time to fill it out. Tell us a little bit more about the other topics or ideas that you would like us to present here at the museum. We really, really want more programs like this, really where we get groups together dialoguing about issues. I think we certainly have scope to continue this conversation and have more programming around it. I love the idea of having a meal where we're having a conversation with this people on the other side of the screen somewhere else. So any ideas that you have that you want to pitch to us, the questionnaires are out there. Please take time to do that. Thanks again to our panel.